Hello and welcome to Stage 4 of the TTA World Championship. This is a match between Lemmingsplayer and Vortex1612. I am going to just say outright that I'm a bit biased here. Lemmingsplayer I know from various Twitch streams and places inside of the Discord server, and so I am biased and am excited to see him play, but I did also speak with Lemmingsplayer about this particular game because I had some questions about decisions that he made, and I am hoping that we will get a little bit more insight on how top players play this game. One of the exciting things about watching high-level TTA is that there are decisions that are made based on future turns or based on conditions inside the game that we don't really see when a high-level player when we just watch the replay. And so this will be kind of a really cool opportunity to go through and see inside the head of a high-level player. So before we get started, let's go ahead and go through the leaders and wonders. Let's start with age 3. So we've got the Manhattan Project, Hollywood, Empire State, and International Red Cross is the age 3 wonders. Then we've got Churchill, Gates, Einstein, Gandhi, and Chaplin, and Mandela as our age 3 leaders. Notable leaders in age 2 are Cook, Maria Theresa, Gaudi, Newton, and the military action leaders. We do have Suez Canal along with Cook, so colonization is kind of a little bit of a strategy you can run with here. And then we also have Ocean Liner and Maria, so that's also another strategy that can be run. On top of that, we have in age 1, we have Isabella, Christopher Columbus, so this is really playing heavily into a colonization strategy where you run Isabella or Columbus, get Suez, and then go Cook. So you get kind of a threefold type of colonization strategy here. On top of that, we also have the Colossus from age A. So there's a lot of colonization potential here, as well as the ability to utilize those benefits. As far as the other age 3 or age 1 leaders go, one of the other notable ones is Nostradamus. And then you have your AJ leaders and wonders with Roman roads, pyramids, Colossus, hanging gardens, and the AJ leaders. So that's kind of how this game is looking, how it's shaking out. So let's hop into the game here. So right away, Lemmingsplayer ends up taking Colossus over Roman roads. And this I actually found very interesting because if I was in this game, I probably would have just taken Roman roads over Colossus despite all of the various colonization possibilities, just because I think Roman roads is a really good wonder. However, Lemmingsplayer had a different idea in mind. He did not take Roman roads and instead took the Colossus because he was afraid of Caesar plus the Colossus. So the reason this is a problem is because Caesar has +1 strength. In fact, here, let me go ahead and just pull this up. Caesar's got +1 strength here. And then on top of that, you have the extra strength from the Colossus here. And that is 2 extra strength. So 3 extra strength from Caesar plus Colossus is a very dangerous combination, and it can prove to be very difficult, especially since Caesar has 2 political actions he can take every turn. It means that he could potentially get an aggression through, and that could cause some issues, especially if you're struggling already with resources, depending on how the cards come down the row. On top of that, he also thought that taking away Colossus made it so that his opponent really didn't have an awesome choice for a leader. He had Homer, Aristotle, and Caesar. And Caesar isn't really that good without Colossus. And Aristotle does not pair very well with Roman roads because Roman roads requires too many civil actions to be built, and Aristotle is better at using civil actions to generate science. So in both cases, he had not really a great action for taking a leader. So he thought that this was a good play. He thought this was kind of his best choice. Our opponent takes takes Roman roads and frugality and ends his turn, which all seems pretty normal. So in age 1, as it begins, Lemmingsplayer takes Hammurabi, which is pretty standard. Hammurabi is a great leader, and he works well with almost any strategy and almost any wonder. Builds the mine, increases the population, and ends his turn. And then we have Vortex, who curiously, instead of taking Cleopatra, decides to go for Alexander the Great. I think that's a bit of a mistake, and here Lemmingsplayer actually points out that this is kind of a mistake. The main reason that you don't want to go Alexander is because Alexander requires civil actions. Because of the way Alexander is made, you remove him from play and add a yellow token to your bank, which means that you have to use another civil action in order to elect a new leader. You don't get that civil action back, which means you require actually an extra civil action in order to go Alexander the Great, because otherwise you will be short since you have to use one to elect a leader. And so Lemmingsplayer actually explains that he thinks this is a bit of a mistake, and as we'll see later on, he will explain why he believes that is a mistake, but he thinks that the civil action problem is the problem. And we actually both agreed that Cleopatra would have been a much better choice here, simply because Cleopatra plus Roman roads is a great combination, and it allows you to be very flexible and finish Roman roads very early. So that was kind of our thought process there, and that's kind of how we proceeded. So then Vortex ends his turn. Lemmingsplayer then begins. He builds a second lab, takes the engineering genius, and then takes the drama, and then increases his population. This is where I deviated a little bit. Me personally, I would have waited, and I would not have built this second lab. I would have instead waited to see if printing press showed up. However, when I asked him why he did this, he said the main reason he did not want to go for printing press is mostly that there aren't really great printing press leaders, and if he takes printing press, or if he waits and decides to go on printing press, he runs into a bit of a problem. One moment here while I pull up his thoughts. Not really a great printing press game, and then if he waited, then he would have trouble spending all 4 of his actions after taking the engineering genius, because he wasn't really going to be able to utilize, because he had the extra action from Hammurabi, he was going to run into a problem where he wouldn't be able to spend all of his civil actions because he didn't have enough to do. He took the drama here so that he would have something to do if he had nothing to do next turn. He was expecting irrigation to probably go away, or knights maybe, but he figured that with engineering genius, he wouldn't really have any way to complete the rest of his civil action. So he was just trying to be efficient here. So that's kind of where he runs with this. So that's why he takes the drama, engineering genius, and then builds the second second lab immediately. Vortex goes for Nostradamus after using Alex the Great immediately, which is a fine decision. And then ends his turn after building the second lab and increasing his population. All pretty standard stuff. Then Lemmingsplayer takes irrigation, mans it immediately, and then uses engineering genius after taking cultural heritage. He uses engineering genius to complete one stage of the Colossus and ends his turn. Pretty standard stuff there as well. Vortex seeds, and the development of trade routes has been opened, and he then takes iron, develops the iron, builds by upgrading it, and then because he saved through frugality and through Alex the Great, he increases his population again. So all pretty standard so far. Lemmingsplayer then finishes the Colossus, takes the Universitas because it is now on 2 civil actions, takes the breakthrough, and increases his population. The main reason he takes the Universitas here is just because it's a pretty good wonder, and since it was only 2 civil actions, it's actually a pretty good deal. On top of that, he notices that iron is on the card row, so he'll be able to get that for at least 2 civil actions, if not 1 later, since his opponent, Vortex, has already taken it, which means he'll be able to upgrade it and then easily get his Universitas rolling. So all pretty stock standard stuff here. Again, Vortex seeds, and we see the development of science. And then Vortex takes irrigation, develops it, builds one irrigation, and then upgrades another mine to iron. Since he has the extra population, he can afford to increase his economy and build warriors if he needs to later. Development of religion is then opened once Lemmingsplayer cedes. He takes the iron for one civil action, develops it, and then takes the monarchy and then upgrades one of the mines and increases his population. So this is the first kind of deviation between what I would have done and what he decided to do. And I find it actually very intriguing. So the main thing I was curious about is why he developed the iron without using his breakthrough here. And at first I figured that perhaps he wanted to save the breakthrough for the monarchy by developing drama or something. But when I asked him about it, one thing he actually specifically mentions is that he had not seen Dark Ages, and he knew he was planning next turn to go for a revolution with monarchy, which means that if he goes for the revolution with monarchy and Dark Ages is revealed after he uses the breakthrough, then he runs into a problem where he loses science because of that, and he doesn't want to end up with that problem. So what he decided to do was use the iron without breakthrough, save the breakthrough for something else, and then he's going to go for a revolution next turn with monarchy, which was very interesting. One of the things that I had not particularly planned on was the revolution. I have trouble discovering when a revolution is good versus when it's bad, and I oftentimes think that it's always better to try, if you can, to do it peacefully so that you can save the civil actions. But in this case, for example, going for a revolution was better, and once we get to the next turn, I can explain kind of his thought process on that, and we can go through why a revolution was a little bit better for him here. So he ends his turn in a pretty good position. Vortex finishes the Roman roads and then ends his turn. Pretty standard. So now we have the development of settlement finally opening up, and so that is the next stage. Lemmingsplayer goes for the revolution, takes the next breakthrough, and then ends his turn. Now, the reason why he went for a revolution here is actually really clever, and it's pretty important to recognize. So the first thing to understand is that on one civil action, really the only card that he really wanted out of this group and that he could actually take was the breakthrough, which he ended up taking here. So knowing that he could take the breakthrough using Hammurabi's military action here as a civil action, he realized that if he were to go for a revolution, this really wouldn't hurt him too bad, as all of these cards for one civil action really aren't great. And on top of that, the cards on two civil actions that are going down to one really aren't all that impressive for him either. So these 5 cards are going to be coming down the card row. While he would like the engineering genius, the fact that it's on 2 civil actions makes it so it's not worth it, and it's better to just go for the revolution. However, the thing is, this only would have happened if his opponent had not taken any cards previously, which he didn't. If you'll notice, previously he just finished his Roman roads here. And once he finished his Roman roads, he just ended the turn, meaning the engineering genius would be stuck on 2 civil actions. So Lemmingsplayer, the turn previous to this one, had planned that engineering genius would be on 2 and he wouldn't be able to take it. So he went for a revolution because he felt that he wouldn't really be missing out on too many cards. This is a really genius idea, because one of the other things about this is that he's also avoiding corruption. He's basically buying himself a free turn to build up his wealth so that he can finish his Universitas. And on top of that, since he's avoiding corruption, it's really not a big deal for him to just take the breakthrough, which is really the only good card he was going to take on this route anyway. So really clever, really good usage of a revolution here, and I think that kind of showcases how a higher level player thinks. He saw that Vortex was going to complete his Roman roads, then decided that a revolution would be better because engineering genius, which had previously been up on this slot, comes down and is now on 2 civil actions, and he recognizes he can't take it, so there's no point in trying to save the civil actions to do so, and goes for the rev to give himself a new government form. So very, very clever play from Lemmingsplayer. So 4A comes out and Lemmingsplayer wins it. That's always good to get a strength event. And then Vortex ends up finishing his upgrades and takes engineering genius for whatever wonder comes down the row for him. So Lemmingsplayer loses Hammurabi, but he was not planning on taking any of the other leaders that had shown up on the card row anyway. So he uses the cultural heritage to get a little bit of extra science, takes the code of laws, develops it immediately using a breakthrough, upgrades one of his mines, then upgrades the other mine, and ends his turn. He is still avoiding corruption, and he has made it so that not only is he able to finish his Universitas in one go on his next turn, but that his economy is booming so that he'll be able to recover from building the Universitas with all of his rocks that same turn. So at this point, the only Age 1 leader left for Lemmingsplayer is Christopher Columbus. Now, we can't see his military cards here, but Lemmingsplayer actually claims that he had a colony in his hand that he was going to use with Columbus, which was Vast Territory 1. So his plan was to take Columbus regardless. It's just unfortunate that Columbus arrived late so that he would have to burn an extra civil action to use him. So at this point, Vast Territory 1, I believe, is one of these 2 cards. I think that's what he drew, and so because of that, he's now saving it, and you'll notice when he discards that these Age 2 cards will remain. Or these Age 1 cards will remain, sorry. And he did discard, and that's why those 2 remained. And he knows that he'll be able to get Christopher Columbus for 1 civil action next turn, since it was not at risk of going down to the discard spot, so he doesn't attempt to take Columbus for 2 civil actions. Vortex ends up taking Forbidden City to try and get an extra civil action, which is okay, but the problem is that he takes it for 3 civil actions, which could form a bit of a problem, as using that last civil action will prove difficult. He has to build a warrior and then increase his population to avoid corruption, which is okay for right now because he wanted to build a warrior. Let's say he wanted to build a warrior anyway, but he's running into a bit of an issue now where he has to avoid corruption constantly because he wasn't unable to spend it. Pestilence comes out, which is fine for both of them as they both have idle workers. So Pestilence isn't too big of a deal. Now we see Lemmingsplayer take Columbus. And the Columbus take here was again planned from when he got Vast Territory. He finishes the Universitas in one go and then upgrades his final farm. And then ends his turn. So now we can see that they're both sitting on really good economies here. Scientific Breakthrough comes out, which is a little bit better for Lemmingsplayer because he has slightly better science due to his Universitas, which is always nice. Vortex ends up taking the Justice System and developing it immediately. Then he ends up taking the Cannon, increasing his population, and then ending his turn, which is all well and good. Good Harvest comes out, and this is also where Lemmingsplayer says that there's a bit of an issue, and we'll show that on Vortex's next turn. So he ends up taking the strategy and the cavalryman. Then he takes the breakthrough from H2, increases his population, develops the cavalrymen, and then builds one of them in order to avoid corruption. So this is where I was a little bit confused again, because if it were me, I would have developed the drama, and then I would have manned it with at least one of my empty populations. Since I had 3 extra, I could easily man the drama. Then I would be increasing my culture population, solving the happy face problem, and I'd be using my free population that I had sitting here doing nothing. So when I asked him about this, about why he instead decided to develop the cavalryman and then man it, there were a couple of reasons why. The first one really was because he was wanting to get a little bit of military pressure on Vortex. With Nostradamus, since he gets the extra 3 strength due to strength events, having 6 strength means that Vortex is a little bit worried to seed. And Lemmingsplayer did say that he had barbarians seeded, but that wasn't really the main reason. He wanted to put some military pressure on him. Then he also explained that when he developed the cavalryman and strategy, he needed the breakthrough because his science was going to be lacking a little bit for both of those. Since both cavalryman and strategy are age 2, and he only has 4 science production, he's going to need the breakthroughs to make sure he can develop them on time without losing too much tempo. The other reason that he develops that is because he has, at this point, his tactic, one of his age 2 tactics here, whichever one that is mobile artillery. And since Vortex had already taken 1 cannon, he just needed to wait for the next one. And since he already had cavalrymen ready, he'd be able to take and develop the cannon if it showed up early, and have mobile artillery ready for a war and aggression or anything like that. Finally, his plan here is to, he said that his eventual plan was to go journalism and then wait for Newton and develop journalism along with Newton to get better science production and a little bit more culture. And so with that in mind, what he wanted to do was make sure that he had enough science to develop everything he needed to, have the breakthrough so that he could have the journalism, and then also have enough population and enough rocks to build journalism so that he could use it once he developed it. Now, this is the first part where things get really interesting, and this is where a high-level player begins thinking better than a beginner such as myself. So I then asked him, well, journalism right now is on 2 civil actions, and when it goes down the card row, it's actually going to end up here for 1 civil action. Wouldn't Vortex want to just deny it from Lemmingsplayer? So I asked him, were you worried about a denial since it was on 1 civil action? And this is where Lemmingsplayer actually said he was not worried because Vortex actually needs the Conmon. He has no choice but to go for a Conmon. So the Conmon was extremely necessary for him because Lemmingsplayer already has a significant military advantage after building the cavalryman. As you can see, he's got 6 to Vortex's 5 at best. And that's only if it's weaker. If Lemmingsplayer does a war, then Vortex is going to end up in a lot worse position. So he needs the Conmon because he needs the military actions. If Vortex does not take the Conmon, Lemmingsplayer would have denied it immediately. Because if Vortex goes for the Republic, Lemmingsplayer already has the strategy in hand. Which means Vortex would be stuck on 2 military actions, basically until age 3, which would be devastating because Lemmingsplayer has better military. He would have the Conmon. He doesn't need it, but he would have it, or the strategy plus the monarchy, which would give him anywhere between 5 to 6 military actions. So he would be able to blow him up militarily, especially since he's already developed the cavalry and he knows that he'll be able to go with his mobile artillery tactic, which Vortex will no longer be able to copy until he's certain that there's another cavalryman. So all this being said, Lemmingsplayer determined that Kanman was absolutely necessary for Vortex. He did not have any time to take journalism. I personally had not even considered that. I didn't even know that that was a thing. But when he explained it, it made perfect sense. Now, the other thing that he mentions is that by this time, he had actually drawn Vast Territory 2 in his hand, which meant that let's just say, for example, the Vortex does end up not taking Kanman, denies the journalism, so on and so forth. Well, with the Vast Territory, he now has 4 yellow cubes that he fills up. He can pump out population, no problem, especially with his current 7 food. He knows for a fact that he could pump out population for a military and that his military would be way stronger than Vortex's. Vortex would never be able to match that because he would be stuck on, at best, Republic, but at worst, he'd be stuck on despotism. So, this is a really clever play where he recognized the necessity that Vortex had of taking Kanman here that allowed him to get journalism for 1 civil action. Very, very clever. So now Lemmingsplayer actually mentions that turn 10 was a really rough turn for Vortex here, and I'll explain it once we go through it. So Barbarians comes out, which means that Lemmingsplayer does not have to deal with it, and Vortex gets hit, so he loses a population. He ends up finishing the Forbidden City, and then takes the Kanman, and then in order to avoid corruption, he builds another warrior, places the tactic to get stronger, and then ends his turn. So this doesn't look terribly rough. It doesn't look horrible for him. But in reality, this was actually a really rough turn. The biggest reason, according to Lemmingsplayer, is, number 1, Rifleman being on 2 civil actions. The thing is, because it's on 2 civil actions, Vortex can't afford to really take it, because then he would be using 4 civil actions out of his total of 6 right now just to take technologies that he wouldn't even be able to use right away. That would really hurt him in the long run. And then he wouldn't be able to finish Forbidden City that turn. He wouldn't be able to avoid corruption by building his warrior to finish off the corruption. It basically, because Rifleman is on 2 and Kanman was on 2, it forced Vortex into a really, really poor position that made it so that he was kind of forced to finish Forbidden City, build an extra warrior, and take Kanman all on that turn. Now, the other thing that made it really difficult was, if we go up here, Lemmingsplayer also mentioned Good Harvest. Now, the reason this is so bad is because of this right here. Vortex gets 4 extra food. Now, if we look at his farms, we can see that that means he got 2 extra blue tokens here. These 2 blue tokens here were given to him extra by the event of Good Harvest. Now, the reason that's a problem is because now he is absolutely forced to build the warrior to avoid corruption. He has no choice. If he does not build this warrior to avoid, he will go through corruption, and then corruption will begin hurting him quite a bit. Eventually, what would happen is he would have to constantly try and spend even more per turn to try and avoid corruption. And eventually, this -2 would bleed into here and become -4, and then that would eventually bleed into here and become -6, and you'd be losing 6 resources per turn, which is a problem. So this was a really rough turn for Vortex, and Lemmingsplayer recognized how bad it was and understood that this was kind of one of the turning moments of the game. So that was the rough turn for Vortex. He is now kind of sitting in a kind of a waiting spot at this point, unable to take the things that he wanted. So he ends his turn, and then Lemmingsplayer goes ahead and takes the journalism as he claimed, as well as developing Vast Territory 2. He immediately builds the journalism, takes the wave, the revolutionary idea, and then increases his population and ends his turn. So what's really important here, he's got the vast territory, which means he'll be able to pump out lots of population. He's got lots of food, and he's able to avoid corruption because his rock count is low. Now, the other thing that he mentions at this point is that he knows that his opponent Vortex does not have, in either of these cards, the tactic Defensive Army. And the reason he knows he doesn't have Defensive Army is because he actually drew it. He drew Defensive Army and then discarded it. So he knew that he had Mobile Artillery, which was a very, very powerful tactic for him to have. And he knew that he was in a good spot to beat Vortex in a battle, because he was fairly confident that Vortex did not have the classic army. So, since he was aware that he could beat him in a military battle, he was feeling very confident at this moment and recognized that his military might was much higher and had much more potential than Vortex did. So, he was preparing with Wave of Nationalism and everything else. He was kind of preparing for a bit of a military push. Also, one thing of note is that Isaac Newton is available for 2 civil actions here, but he does not go for Newton. The main reason he doesn't go for Newton here is simply because he believes that Vortex won't attempt to go for it. And even if Vortex does attempt to go for Newton, then at that point, his plan was to go Napoleon and do a heavy, heavy military push. So he was not afraid of Newton being denied either. So let's go ahead and move on to Vortex's turn. So Vortex develops the Kanman as he needed to. He takes Harvard College because he can actually finish it pretty quickly since he has the resources for it. And then yet again, we notice he's forced to build another warrior because he needs to avoid corruption, which is a bit of a problem. He can't take CA, he can't take cards when he is building a warrior. Strategic Territory comes out, and Lemmingsplayer manages to win it by dedicating his entire force of a horse and card. So this is great news for him. The Strategic Territory will play very well for him, as he not only gets extra military cards, but the extra 2 strength will put even more pressure on Vortex. Lemmingsplayer takes Newton, takes the cannon to finish his Mobile Artillery tactic, immediately plays the yellow card, takes strategy, develops the cannon, builds his cavalryman, and then builds his cannon. I'll have to remember what Wave of Nationalism, that's right. Wave of Nationalism, as he was weaker than Vortex and knew that he could use Wave of Nationalism to build his army up for free. So very good play here. And then lastly, he increases his population. So now we can see the effects of Columbus and the vast territory. We see that, one moment here, we see that number 1, Lemmingsplayer has a much more powerful army, along with a more powerful tactic somewhere in his hand, that he can play at any time when he wants to declare a war or go for an aggression. On top of that, we have the Rev idea, which gives us extra science. We still have the drama that we haven't developed, which we can at any point, and then we can immediately man it for extra culture. We have the journalism going for extra science. We have the Universitas for extra science, and then we have the extra lab. So overall, this is looking like a really solid position for Lemmingsplayer. Now, one question I asked him was, Gaudi was available for 2 civil actions here, as we can see. And I asked, why would you not go for Gaudi here, and why would you choose Newton? As I think I personally would have gone for Gaudi, as I would have preferred his extra culture. What Lemmingsplayer stated is that even if Gaudi was on 1, he still would have gone for Isaac Newton because he needed a lot of CAs to get the cannon, strategy, drama, and other technologies that he was going to be developing. He needed a lot of CAs for that. He has 6, which is decent, but that's not going to be quite enough to get that out fast enough to give him an advantage. Taking Newton allows him to use those basically as free civil actions, where every time he develops it, he gets the civil action back. So with this in mind, he's able to develop multiple technologies, man them, and use them without needing to waste time waiting for the next turn. The main thing he was concerned about, though, was the idea that he needed to get both cannons and strategy out to ensure that he would have military pressure. As we can see, he's got 14 strength to Vortex's total of 9 if he has a weakness, if it's something like an aggression. That's a lot of pressure. And considering that Vortex is still currently sitting on exactly 4 actions, he's essentially depending on a colonization card to be in his hand right now for any aggressions that might come up. And if he doesn't get the colonization cards, Lemmingsplayer can blow him out of the water with his military. And the other thing is, Lemmingsplayer has not yet revealed the tactic that he has. Even though he could have, he decided not to because, number one, he wanted to draw 3 military cards for the highest odds for a war, aggression, or really strong strength card to seed. But also that he doesn't need to seed it. He has 14 raw strength without the tactic. There's no need to seed at this. There's no need to put up your tactic at this point. So at this point, he recognizes that his military pressure is high enough that he's able to force Vortex into making some decisions that are suboptimal because he's worried about the military. So let's continue here. Vortex takes Gaudi to try and generate more culture, increases his population a couple of times, develops the cannon, and then takes the reserves, frugality, builds a second cannon, and then uses the frugality to increase his population one more time. So the reason this was kind of an issue here is because he's got no tactic that will work with the cannons that he built. And Lemmingsplayer actually said that he drew fortifications shortly after winning the strategic territory. So at this point, none of these cards here can be any tactics that involve cannons and involve warriors. Which means Lemmingsplayer knows he's got a tactical advantage on him, which is very, very strong because he understands his military will always be more powerful. At least until age 3, which admittedly isn't very long, but that window is crucial because he can completely pressure Vortex with his military because he all he needs to do is drop a tactic. So the next turn, Lemmingsplayer seeds and he gets arms industry, and since he has all 3 technologies and he's the best in all of them, at least, he ends up getting the extra rocks. Lemmingsplayer then develops drama, mans it, takes the reserves, takes the urban growth, increases his population, builds an extra cannon, and then finishes off by building another drama and taking rich land. So the military pressure is fairly significant. At this point, Lemmingsplayer has a pretty high numbers advantage on Vortex in terms of military. Vortex doesn't seed. He takes the opera, develops it immediately, takes the breakthrough for 3 civil actions, mans the opera, takes the team sports, and then increases his population. So this turn was actually a bit of an issue for Vortex, according to Lemmingsplayer. According to him, the opera play here was actually really risky because he's essentially giving up a little bit of science and making it so that he's unable to develop things militarily as quickly as he needs to. If he gets lucky, according to Lemmingsplayer, there might be a rev idea that shows up here somewhere on his next turn, and then there might be some sort of military modern infantry or tanks, which both of those would help him because he would have the rev idea that he could use immediately because of Harvard College. But the issue is that he can't develop those without the rev idea. And since he has the breakthrough and he didn't use it on Opera, it means that any military technologies that come down for him at this point are going to be impossible to use because he only has 6 science. And he can't use breakthrough to get the 6 science. What Lemmingsplayer claims he should have done is taken the Opera, taken the breakthrough, and then discovered the Opera or developed the Opera with the breakthrough to give him a little bit of extra science, a little bit of a boost, so that he'd be able to take modern tanks modern or tanks. Unfortunately, he doesn't do this, and this is kind of a risky play because he's assuming that Lemmingsplayer either doesn't have a good tactic, doesn't have a war, and doesn't have an aggression. And that's very risky. It's a very risky play to make, especially since he's a little bit behind regardless as far as military goes. He's behind already. So he is increasing culture production, but if Lemmingsplayer has anything up his sleeve, Vortex is in a lot of trouble. So at this point, Lemmingsplayer does in fact declare a war, the war over technology, which is a huge problem because now if Lemmingsplayer wins it, Vortex is going to be out tech and he won't be able to develop any new military technologies. Essentially, this is a really bad war that Lemmingsplayer is sure he will win. So we'll notice that he now plays the tactic that he was hiding. He has 2 sets of this army. He takes the oil because he'll be able to develop it next turn. Plays the reserves. Immediately mans the oil. Takes the efficient upgrade. And then ends his turn. Okay. So he now goes from 17 strength. He previously, before this, he had 17 strength. He goes from 17 strength all the way up to 30 strength. And it is impossible for Vortex to match that, which means Lemmingsplayer will be able to steal technology this next turn. So this is a really big war. In essence, this is where the end of the game starts happening, and this is where things start falling apart for Vortex very quickly. Vortex takes democracy, takes military build-up, plays it immediately due to Harvard College, destroys a single lab, builds another cannon, builds another 2 cannons, in fact, makes the arena, develops the arena and mans it, and then ends his turn. So he's managed to close the gap by 10. However, this 10 is actually crucial because he only has 11 science. On top of that, he might lose his code of law, his justice system. Now, the biggest thing that is holding him back at this point is the fact that his military is comprised entirely of warriors and cannons. Not only does he not have a tactic for that, but on top of that, the only tactics he can get now are age 3, and warriors do not work with age 3. Since he was unable to take riflemen back in age 2 when it was on 2 civil actions, that means that he now has to wait for modern infantry for any of his warrior tactics to work. This is a huge problem for him, and it means that Vortex is going to be struggling militarily the rest of the game. On top of that, because he had to dedicate so many resources, he had to destroy a lab, which means he's down an extra science. He was unable to deny military theory, which is a huge problem. And even though he did build an extra urban building for Gaudi, and he does have 11 culture production, Lemmingsplayer will be able to easily take it if he gets any wars. So now Vortex is just hoping and praying that Lemmingsplayer doesn't have any other wars. The outcome of the war, Lemmingsplayer just steals the raw science. He has no interest in taking the justice system. And then he has a second war. And this is where things just collapse entirely. Lemmingsplayer takes air forces, develops air forces, destroys one of his own labs as he has enough science production, takes the air forces immediately, then upgrades an iron to oil to give him extra resources, takes the military theory, develops it over strategy, then takes the engineering. At this point, the engineering take is just a denial. He's making it so that Vortex can't try and use it to build a whole bunch of urban buildings. On top of that, he can just get it because he can. He has enough production that he can do that. At this point, with 42 strength to 20 and Vortex not having a way to come back from that, this game looks pretty much over. Lemmingsplayer again draws 2 military cards. Vortex does indeed have the tactic here of positional army. However, the problem is it's outdated. If all 4 of these warriors were riflemen or modern infantry, he would probably have just as much strength, if not more strength, than Lemmingsplayer. But the problem is he was unable to take either of those technologies because one didn't show up and the other one he was unable to take due to his civil actions problem. And now he's in a lot of trouble because this is as strong as he gets. If you'll notice, his food production is now 1 per turn, and he requires 5 of them, so he's not going to be pumping out any more military anytime soon. He has 7 total rocks, which he can't really use on anything because he doesn't have extra population. He can use it to build wonders, but that's all he can do. At this point, Lemmingsplayer is free to just run over Vortex the rest of this game. Vortex takes the multimedia because he'll be able to develop it next turn, takes the urban growth, takes the reserves to allow him to get extra food, uses the reserves to get an extra population, and builds a cannon. But unfortunately, that's not quite enough. Lemmingsplayer still has a significant lead. He ends up stealing 14 culture, so a total of 28 culture swing, which is a really large swing, especially at this low of a culture count. Lemmingsplayer then seeds and civil unrest hits, but nobody has discontent workers, so it doesn't change anything. He uses the revolutionary idea to develop engineering, which allows him to then increase his population, place it on a drama, take the Empire State, which he knows he can build pretty easily since he has tons of production with rocks, and then he ends his turn. Ravages of Time comes out, and Vortex is now forced to crumble his Forbidden City, which I am wondering why he would do that. Since it's age 3, you could just crumble Roman roads and it would make no difference. Instead, he chooses to get rid of his Forbidden City, which gives him an extra civil action and allows him to use workers. This was a bit of a strange decision for me. But I think he at this point recognized that the game was just basically over, as if Lemmingsplayer had drawn any other wars, which it was very likely that he had, Vortex was going to lose it pretty hard. He develops the multimedia, mans it immediately with the extra population that he had, and then tries taking Hollywood to see if he can finish it. He takes the endowment so that he'll be able to overtake Lemmingsplayer once again once he goes lower on culture. Lemmingsplayer then declares a hybrid war. Now this is where the Forbidden City would have helped tremendously, because the hybrid war would have meant that these two were ignored entirely and Vortex would be okay, but now they are discontent. This is where this is a really clever play from Lemmingsplayer that I think needs to be highlighted quite a bit. He has the hybrid war, so he has 2 discontent workers. So what he does is he ends up taking Chaplain for the happy faces. Then he plays Chaplain to get those happy faces on his board, removes the science as he recognizes he's not going to need it anymore, removes one of his mines as he has enough mines, he has enough production from his oils that he doesn't need this iron. Then he ends up taking an irrigation. All right, I apologize. I'm back. I had to pause for a quick moment here. Lemmingsplayer just increases his armies here by building the extra air force. He destroyed actually 2 of his farms, so now all he has left is just the 1. And if you'll notice, he only had the 1 because even though he is going to be experiencing famine, or I shouldn't say famine, even though his food is going to be now going down every turn, there's only 10 cards left in the Age 3 deck. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cards are going away this turn, which means that on the next turn, this will go down to 5, and that guarantees that the end of the age will be the turn on Lemmingsplayer's next turn. So he doesn't actually need this food anymore. He doesn't need his farms, and he doesn't really need his science production either, because he's just going to be taking all of the culture from Vortex. I know that I skipped a couple of moves here, so I'll just show you exactly what he did. He destroys a lab, a mine, a farm. He ends up taking the movies, builds a cannon, cavalrymen, and air forces so that he has 61 strength in total. And then he ends his turn. So now at this point, this is where the game is over, as Vortex really doesn't have a way to come back from this. Economic progress takes place, but again, Lemmingsplayer is still not worried because he had 4 total food instead of 2 or 1. Vortex ends up destroying a lab, builds an extra arena to deal with the hybrid war, then destroys his temple to build another warrior, and then he ends his turn after taking the reserves in urban growth. So at only 35 strength, unfortunately, this means that Lemmingsplayer will be stealing quite a lot of culture. And we see that Lemmingsplayer ends up stealing 26 cultures for a total of 52 culture swing, which is enormous. And in a low culture game such as this one, or I guess medium culture, a 52 culture swing essentially is game deciding. And that is exactly what happened here. Now, the age does not end exactly on Lemmingsplayer's turn because Vortex does not end up taking enough cards to end the age on Lemmingsplayer's turn. Therefore, he's able to declare 1 more war. But at this point, the game has been over since the previous war. He builds 1 more, goes up to 71 strength, develops the movies, upgrades all 3 of... he upgrades 2 of his dramas to movies, takes the reserves so that he can make sure to finish Empire State next turn, and ends his turn. Vortex at this point is kind of in shambles. Refugees comes out, but that's the least of Vortex's worries. He takes Einstein to hopefully get a little bit of extra culture. Builds an extra multimedia by destroying a warrior as he knows the game is basically over. Uses the rest of his yellow cards. Takes computers. Develops it. But he's unable to man it. And at 27 strength to 71, that means that the next one will be almost 100-point swing. So Lemmingsplayer ends up completely destroying Vortex here. He even gets off the aggression. So now Lemmingsplayer's up to 194 culture to Vortex's 29. He builds an extra farm to make sure that he doesn't go into famine. Destroys one of his warriors. And then finishes off his Empire State to make sure that he's actually making more food than him, which means he gets all of the bonuses from Empire State. Oops. All of the Empire State bonuses are now his, except for, of course, the science one, which Vortex has soundly in the bag with his 2 multimedias and Einstein. But culture, farms and rocks, he has him beat, and so he gets a smooth bit of culture there. Finally, he ends up taking patriotism and ends his turn. Vortex then seeds an impact. Unfortunately, will not be enough. He takes the strategic territory, but it's too little too late. He develops democracy to get 3 extra culture. Finishes Hollywood, which gives him a little bit of extra, and then ends his turn after destroying a warrior to build 1 temple for that small boost. As we go into the final impacts, we see that Lemmingsplayer has 241 culture to Vortex's 71. I apologize, I messed this up. Impact of culture comes out first, which Lemmingsplayer has safely in the bag because of his Charlie Chaplin. Next, we have Impact of Science, which is very clearly for Vortex, but unfortunately, making up this kind of a gap with impacts is nigh impossible. In fact, it probably is entirely impossible. Hit continue here. I apologize that I hit this wrong, but Impact of Population comes out. Lemmingsplayer still wins it. And then the final impact that is evaluated is the impact of Happiness, which Vortex, again, is a little bit better, but again, Lemmingsplayer is just far stronger. And with that, the game is over with Lemmingsplayer winning with 277 culture to 109, which is a total difference of 256 culture. Or 66, I should say. 266 culture. Quite the game from Lemmingsplayer. A very powerful win. One thing that Lemmingsplayer did mention is that when he developed the movies a while ago, which was on, I believe, turn... it will not show. On one of his turns when he developed the movies, he actually could have developed it with Isaac Newton to save a civil action, but it turned out not to matter too much because Vortex had no way to match the military might. So this was a very good game that was full of some very subtle but powerful decisions from Lemmingsplayer that allowed him to have a very particular advantage over Vortex that Vortex was entirely unaware of. I apologize, I accidentally closed out of the... One of the things was the civil action advantage that he had in Age 2, where he knew that his opponent needed Conmon, which was here, and then moved down to be on 2 civil actions here. And since Rifleman was no longer able to be taken on that same turn, he knew that he was okay to take journalism and not to worry about Rifleman getting taken. On top of that, he also understood that the opera turn meant the opera turn from Vortex, where he took the opera and developed it and then manned it, was very risky because he essentially had to hope and pray that military technologies were coming down the card row. But even if they had, he did not have enough science to develop any of the various military technologies that were coming down the row. So all of this combined led to a very powerful win from Lemmingsplayer that showcases just how good these players really are. They think very far in advance and they consider things that are kind of unseen. It was really unseen that Good Harvest plus the extra civil actions taken by Vortex for his leaders and his wonder would eventually lead to an Age 2 problem. It's a very cool way to understand how the game works, and I think if we learn, anything from this game, The number one thing is to pay attention to some problems that your opponent will have and attempt to play around those issues, because you know that they're going to be doing certain things, whether that be through denials or whether that be through understanding what they may or may not do after having that decision, after making the decision to try and solve that problem. In this case, for example, Lemmingsplayer knew that his opponent had to take Kanmon, and if he didn't, then he would be able to blow him out militarily. But there was many more things that he had considered in this. Knowing that Kanmon was basically the only option meant that he was able to go for journalism, which gave him extra science, and going Newton allowed him to get out the military technologies he needed, and so on and so forth. So a really, really great game from Lemmingsplayer, and I look forward to analyzing a few more of his games. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful rest of your day.